Hello, everyone. This is Lala, and today I'm starting another series. And it's one that I haven't really covered here that I've covered. It's spin-off, The Challenge. And yes, the series that I'm covering is The Real World, which is in many cases seen as the OG of the OG of reality shows. So I guess I should go through my personal history with The Real World. So I always knew that it existed, but I never actively watched it. It wasn't until a friend of mine told me, "Oh, you should watch the challenge," and whatever. I think I mentioned this in some of my older videos. So while I was watching, actually, no, I was going to watch the challenge, but I didn't end up watching it at the time because there's continuity that you had to follow, and it had already been like 25 seasons or something like that. Where the real world, every single season is so insular and isolated, so it's easy to just pick up on it and watch. So, with this in mind, I've only watched two real world seasons. That is the real world Portland, that is the cast with Naya, Avery, Jordan, and Martin, and the Explosion cast. This is the season with Jenna and Corey in it. So, those are only two seasons of the real world that I've watched. Obviously, I've watched the challenge a few times now, and I know many of the people who were on the real world eventually went on the challenge, and a few of them did a few other stuff, so I know a decent amount of these people, just not from the real world. So I wanted to watch the real world from the very beginning to the very end, and it's going to be interesting because I've never really watched 90s reality TV before, and this is the first series that I'm covering that isn't competitive reality TV. It's more of a documentary reality TV, kind of like a Housewives like format before the likes of Housewives or Jersey Shore was even created. So obviously, I'm going to start with the first season, then work my way down. Hopefully, the links that I found covers all real world seasons, and obviously, as I'm going through the seasons, I am going to publish some videos on my other channel if copyright isn't a biatch. So let's just get to it. Obviously, I have to start with the first season, which is known as The Real World New York, or that's its retroactive name. It was just called The Real World, which makes sense because it was the first season. And it aired from May to August 1992, and I'm assuming that it filmed in 1991. So, watching a 1991 reality TV season is going to be very interesting. Obviously, I know four of them from The Challenge, i.e., Heather, Becky, Eric, and Norman, with Norman and Eric being the only ones who did more than one season, and Eric kind of being a vet. All of this was in the first era, and it's interesting that their real world season was almost a decade before their challenge debuts and challenge season. So that's going to be an interesting development to watch. And some of the seasons that I see listed here were a decade after this reworld season, so I'm definitely interested to seeing their origin stories and how it eventually tied to their challenge stories. Okay, so this part that I'm recording now has been done after I officially watched the season, and I did enjoy it. As you all know, I tend to like the older reality TV seasons. The challenge was the exception because I just feel like they didn't get their format yet, and I felt like early Big Brother and early Real World really focused on the socio-political dynamics between the cast, and it was a social experiment. It was promoted as a social experiment, and especially with this season, they definitely treated it as such. It was also interesting to watch it because you could tell that the producers and the editors and the film crew didn't really know what to do. You could tell they weren't consistent, coherent stories. Um, some things would be brought up 1 second that it'd be forgotten about for the rest of the season. Um, the narrative really wasn't linear like that at all. If you look at their confessionals, you can tell that they were recording in different places in the house. There's even a scene where the cast was like eavesdropping on someone doing their confessionals. A lot of the cast were kind of doing their own thing, and you can tell that the producers didn't know what they were doing because there are many moments on the actual season that weren't recorded. I do think that the cast overall gel together, though there are definitely some that were significantly under edited and others who got bloated edits. It's going to be interesting to compare it to the latter seasons to see how much it holds up, but just from me watching this season by itself, I do think it holds up decently for a 33-year-old season, reality TV season, and for the first real world season where I've only watched two of the latter ones up to this point. So I did find it interesting how they introduced the cast, where we really only go to the house of one of them. So Julie is a southern woman who wants to be a dancer, but is from a very religious family. Her father seems very strict and kind of overbearing, where he's telling her when to call every night. Even in the intro, she's arguing with her father, who tells her that he doesn't give a damn about what she thinks, and yeah, I don't vibe with him, just from the little we see here. And I do find it interesting that he's the only one from the family who didn't visit the house from what we saw. So the others end up moving into the house in the order of this: Eric, then Rebecca, then Kevin, then Julie. All of them introduce themselves to one another. Also, Norman, then Heather, then Andre um, enter as well, and none of them get their proper intros, or at least compared to Julie. I didn't understand it at first, but I think because Julie's the youngest and this is her first time leaving home, that's why they did it like that. So I'm going to kind of briefly describe them. So Kevin talks about how he is a writer and a poet and also writes news. Becky went to film school, but she wants to be a singer. Eric has been a model for a year now and is essentially a actor. Norman wants to be a painter, and Heather is with a rap group, or she was with a rap group and recently went solo. And it's very interesting watching how this is the beginning of rap starting to be mainstream. And Andre is in a rock band. Julie arrives and she immediately made a microaggression about Heather selling drugs because she had a beeper. And I didn't know the BS was going to start already. And honestly, she's on my list at this point. And of course, Julie's trying to defend herself, though doing it very poorly. Heather is talking about the racism she deals with and how the cops follow her around whenever she's in stores. And honestly, this just sucks. The cast are talking about generic questions relating to relationships, love, and sex, and relationships. We then see Becky playing music to learn a song where she's performing in front of everyone, and honestly, it wasn't that good, to be honest, in my opinion, the performance. So there was a situation on the bus, and then Julia accuses Kevin of being racist towards white people, where she states that she isn't racist, so she threw that out there. So pretty much that it's brought up that her father did not like black people. What a shocker! And then Heather talks about how black people end up having to hustle due to the society and having a lot of things against them. So people think that them hustling means that they're selling drugs or whatever. A lot of the cast is talking about how open Julie is, despite being from Alabama and them currently being in New York. On to the second episode, we are seeing Eric narrate and talk about a controversial commercial he filmed where he and the girl were ripping off one another's clothes, and he gives some of the women his modeling portfolio. This then somehow leads to him being on a talk show where he is in his underwear only, in or on the talk show, and talking about the content of the commercial causing a lot of controversy. There's a lot of conversation about it in the house, and some claim that he's no different than a playboy. And Heather mentions that she would do something like that if she had no talent. And I guess this part's kind of interesting, knowing what will happen between the two of them later on in the season, where a lot of the commentary comes back up. So we then move on to Heather recording her raps, which is all about date, grape, if you know what I mean, and the system. And it's definitely giving Queen Latifah and MC Light vibes, which is a compliment. This somehow leads to Heather thinking that all Eric cares about is his looks, and then he talks about the stigma of actors essentially being vain and having nothing there outside of their looks. There is some build up regarding a potential romance between Julie and Eric that doesn't really go very far. We then go back to Heather's rapping, where some producers tell her that she sounds too mad and she's just expressionate. I relate to this so much because there's so many times, whether I'm in school or I'm at work, where people misinterpret my passion for anger. Anyways, we have a few scenes of Heather and Julie talking and walking their dog, where they are working through their differences, and then it leads to them laughing at Eric's phone call with a woman. So things are not the best between Julie and Eric because he woke up with her being beside him at 6:30 a.m. and he is annoyed about her asking him to get strawberries and pancakes. Rebecca is trying to be the mediator and Eric is just not having it. Anyways, we move on to them going to the dance studio for one of her classes, and the cast are having fun in the studio. Rebecca sets up Julie to go on a date, which pisses Eric off, and it ends up with him crashing the date, essentially as kind of like a tag along of some sorts. And apparently, he was telling her not to bring the date. It was just very, very weird. I really don't have much to say about episode 3 since it's really just a filler episode, in my opinion. Julie is dancing in the stereo, and we get some content about that, and then we get um to see Eric shooting a set of photos, which changed from its original purpose, and it's Eric being very, very sexual with a woman, which ends up with them kissing and fondling one another. Andre is singing in his band, which ended with the police coming in to tell him that they are getting too many noise complaints. And we then move on to Eric going shopping with the model from the shoot, and they'll end up having something for the next few episodes at least. Rebecca decides to host a cooking event for everyone, then they, i.e., Norman, Heather, and Judy, go roller skating and have a good time. So the episode ends with Norman telling the woman and Rebecca, the woman, that he is bisexual and they like how he doesn't care about what people think of him and she's very confident. We move on to Norman's art show at Andrew's gig while Eric hangs out more with the woman from the shoot. The fourth episode starts with Becky singing and then leads to her talking about her romantic life, but it ends up with the cast talking about their sexual experiences and how old or young they were when they lost their virginities. They are preparing to go to a club, but Becky's trying to get some guys, which Heather does not appreciate, especially with how Rebecca is handling it. After coming from the event, the entire cast decides to go into Kevin and Eric's room and making a bunch of noise, even jumping on the two of them, which the two men didn't appreciate. And I guess having the two men, or them showing the two men sleeping in the room together, will lead up to what happens to them later on in the episode. Eric tells the house that he's tired of smelling cigarette smoke when he is sleeping, where he can deal with it when everyone's awake, but when he's sleeping, he has no consciousness, so he can't choose to remove himself or whatever. And he's talking about Becky without saying her name. A bunch of the roommates are getting annoyed with Eric, and he continues complaining about their lack of cleanliness, which honestly I don't blame him for. If I was living in a situation like this, I would do that too. Kevin ends up walking into the meeting and he complains about people interrupting his sleep, where he chose the most accessible room with a hole in it, where he goes he goes to bed early and then he wakes up early. Clearly, there's a lot of tension at this point, and a bunch of stuff comes up, with Rebecca taking shots at Julie's age, though it's the older ones acting up and staying up later. Somehow, Kevin complains about Eric's sister coming in, though supposedly Kevin said that he wouldn't mind her being there. So Eric's sister ends up sleeping there, though a lot of people have Kevin seen complaints about this. So a letter is written by Kevin to Eric about his feelings, and obviously Eric did not appreciate it or take it well, but others, like Heather and Julie, end up reading it. It gets to the point where everyone in the house ends up reading the letter, and many didn't appreciate Kevin's comment about working twice as hard as the average person. Eric is getting even more pissed off because Kevin's talking about his sister, who's his entire world, and now he hates Kevin. I hate Kevin! Where he's just stewing all day because of it. So we continue right where we left off with this episode, which is episode 5, I believe, where Kevin tells Eric to be a man, where a bunch of people The house guests want the two to talk. I'm assuming it's Eric's friend at this point, since Eric is ranting and calling Kevin a front. He's a front. Kevin felt like Eric was trying too hard to be down, especially cool to black people. I don't see how this is the tea in China regarding the situation at hand, but it does add another layer to it. But Kevin essentially wants Eric to be himself. Essentially. Eric continues to read a note about how he doesn't have a successful father or rich parents. That's what Kevin wrote to Eric, and people keep on mentioning the black and white thing. We do get more backstory about how Eric was supposed to get steroids from a friend, and the principal and detective were looking at them, where they were arrested for trespassing, and it was a year and a half probation. The race stuff is awkward as hell, with Eric talking about how he hangs out with black people all the time and in his life, but the awkwardness is real, even though it's cringe from a 2025 point of view, and it is the point of the show to have these very real but awkward conversations. But in general, he's clearly just not seeing Karen's perspective, which is a part of the privilege that Karen is referring to. We do have more backstory about how Kevin also got in trouble when he was a teenager, and clearly having that in common with Eric, and I'm sure the editors put that in here for a reason. And he talks about how he did not have a father figure in his life. Kevin comes back into the house, and it is awkward as hell, but they continue talking about how Kevin doesn't see how he is dissing Eric's sister, where Eric wants him to speak to his sister to clear it up. Kevin doesn't want to approach her since he isn't being disrespectful. They're yelling about, "This is how I am! No, this is how I am!" over and over and over again. And Kevin pretty much tells Eric that he needs to open up more. And Eric talks about how he is closed off. And I do remember him being like this, especially on World Rules All Stars. So this is a consistency with him. There's more talk about Eric embracing the black race. Oh my gosh, this is so damn awkward. And how black people are better than white people at sports. And Kevin mentions that this is a stereotype, as Kevin is a poet who isn't good at sports. But at the end of it, they do end up making up, and everything is fine between the two of them now. We then move on to Eric talking about his on again, off again love from the 7th grade, who is going to visit, though they just showed him potentially having something with Julia a few episodes ago, and then with the model he did the shoot with. So here's where the lack of consistency when it comes to the editing, especially with this season, this is a prime example of it. So, anyways, this relationship involved his criminal activity, and the woman kind of just watching him get into criminal activity, where Heather and Julia giving him advice on how to handle the situation. We then move on to Eric talking about his relationship with his mom, and they are very close, and he talks about how he does want to help kids. And this is another example of just the edit being all over the place. But at this point in the season, Eric's edit is so much larger than everyone else's, where he speaks to someone that works with kids, and he ends up volunteering, I believe. His on again, off again love, Misty, I believe that's her name, arrives in the house, and then it ends up with Eric taking Kevin to a basketball game where they meet players like Dennis Rodman, Isaiah Thomas, and all of that. We do learn that Eric's father is a referee, and that's how they got the tickets. Where we get more backstory about how Eric doesn't see his father much, and Kevin talks about how his father disowned him at ages 8 or 9. So he was reflecting on that, just watching Eric and his father interact with one another. Episode 6 starts with Kevin asking Julie questions about romance, where she does reveal that she is a virgin. This leads to us seeing her go on a date, and the cast ends up asking her about it, though it didn't go the best. We do see Kevin with his girlfriend for a bit, and then he talks about his parents, and we do actually see his mother here. I forgot to mention that he and Eric live in New Jersey, which isn't far from New York, or at least the cities in New Jersey that they live in. That's why we see their family life and stuff like that more, and why they end up leaving the house a lot more in comparison. And Kevin talks about his father telling his mother that Kevin is not his child and disowning him in front of the both of them, essentially. The cast decides that they need to actually take the time to get to know one another, where everyone else is more focused on their own things in New York. Anyways, they start their planned dinner after Norman feels a way about his Star Trek not being recorded since he's a Trekkie or whatever, and Kevin wasn't even there for the dinner that he brought up, as he forgot that he had a poetry reading. Anyways, they record the dinner so Kevin could see it, and they wanted to pull some prank where they pretended to have a different personality. Kevin enters the house and sees the others acting completely different. He was definitely weirded out about it, especially with Julie's changing, being more promiscuous, supposedly, where he tells her that she needs to be herself. It's definitely a lighter, more filler episode. Due to all this, he does end up leaving, though. So we are at the midpoint of the season with episode 7, and the cast is completely shocked with Kevin's reaction. Since they know that they aren't good actors, so they thought that he would be able to tell that they're faking this. Kevin does return and is told that the entire thing is fake, and he watched the tape that they recorded at the dinner that he missed. The women are talking about attractive men, and Heather is telling them that Larry Johnson is her husband, and she wants to get arrested just to grab his ass. So she has a huge crush on him. Anyways, the women are going to Jamaica, and apparently I read up that this was producer planned because the guys were seeing women, but the girls really weren't, so they organized this so they could have that footage, essentially. We have a lot more Jamaica and Larry Johnson talk, and Heather does end up seeing Larry Johnson with Julie at a game, and they did have a brief conversation before the game and speaking after the game, though they ended up missing their last stop back to New York, supposedly. So, just when I thought nothing would come from the episode, really, there's a huge discussion about the country and the politics. Though it's mainly with Becky talking about how much she likes the United States and how voting is kind of a mixed bag because no matter who they vote for, nothing much is really done. Kevin enters the conversation and he mentions that he doesn't agree that it is a good country since it's racist as hell, but he wants her to explain what she means, and then she talks about how it is a melting pot. Kevin does not think it is a melting pot since people are not melting together, where she sees it as people from different cultures coming together. Where he doesn't agree with that, where Kevin and even Norman kind of mentions that essentially Becky is proposing a utopia and she is ignoring that the land was stolen by indigenous people. Kevin is offended about her saying that he has a chip on his shoulder and how he's making a good speech about how he's discriminated due to his race, where she mentions that she's discriminated against based on her sex. So you get to see this a lot in conversations like this, where a black man and a white woman tends to argue about who's more discriminated against, and they tend to argue about identity politics and who's more victimized. Essentially, that's kind of what the layer of this argument is. So, Kevin mentions that there's data about women benefiting more from the civil rights movement than black people. I actually need to look that up just for my personal self. She says that what he's saying is a bunch of crap, and he says that she's insulting his intelligence. He calls her a racist for that comment, and she made a comment about assuming that he was stealing something on the very first night, and he says that race plus power. It's a very layered argument overall. She ends up throwing her hat that she's wearing on her head at him. He says something about her mother or something like that, and then he calls her a bitch. So, before I looked up what happened on Homecoming, I thought this was a relatively innocent conversation, and from the situation with Homecoming, maybe she had more nefarious thoughts about it. And then looking up a bit about Kevin after this and some of the comments he made, maybe some of them had a point. It's very, very layered, and you could somewhat see both sides. We are at episode 8, and the women are flying to Jamaica. And it's crazy how they didn't make the entire cast go, but this is still freshman reality TV, so that rule wasn't created yet. And the goal is to find men. I kind of discussed the content of this a few minutes prior. Back at the house, it shows the guys not really talking like that initially, but we do see Kevin and Andre making a poem and song about how much they wanted to go to Jamaica, and they start to bond as well. Becky talks about her fight with Kevin to the woman since she doesn't get why he can't have a debate without going personal, as they're essentially arguing the same thing, but from different perspectives. And I really find it very interesting that we never got Heather's perspective on this, as she's a black woman. And honestly, I don't even recall her and Kevin interacting like that on the edited episodes, or them talking about race at all to one another. The women do start getting closer to one another and they go to a nude beach. We have more Kevin and Andre conversing as the former is asking the latter about his life and the latter asks the former about his fight with Becky, which Kevin outright denied happened, which is just very weird. And it's interesting that he did this here, which you would do in a situation a few episodes from now, but the only difference is that this was caught on camera, the future event wasn't. So I think that's why people reacted the way they did then, but we'll get to it when we get there. The woman called Andre, and there's a nice banter between all of them. We do see Andre's band go to a radio show to promote their song, and then we have the woman actually talking to some men. Anyways, they come back to the house, and most of the guys aren't there, so it was relatively quiet. So it was a relatively quiet welcome home. They described their trip to Eric, and apparently Becky did get some, but it was with one of the producers of the show that they're currently filming, so he got fired, essentially. We do learn that Norman came back from a great date, which he's describing to some of the women. So the episode kind of closes up with Kevin and Becky finally having a conversation about their fight, and he tells her that he regrets calling her a bitch, and she wasn't trying to offend him, his life or his perspectives, but he just wanted to hear her perspective. So it seems like all is good between the two of them now. One thing that I will say about this episode is that I focus a lot on the people who didn't get much screen time up to this point. We actually got to see Norman's date named Charles in the beginning of the ninth, I believe, episode. Julie and Andre walked around across an encampment by the New York River, and it really caught her eye. She speaks to one of the women who is homeless named Darlene, and they talk about the stuff she had, and the woman's been homeless for a year, and she doesn't get along with her mother, and she's struggling to find an apartment, as the welfare is not enough for the $425 a month for an apartment. I wish the prices for apartments were that in 2025. After a long conversation, Julie decides to spend the night with the woman. This is very dangerous for many reasons, and it's crazy that the producers actually allowed this. Anyways, we then move on to some of the cast members going to a rally, and they, as well as some other people, are handing out anti-AIDS posters. It's honestly crazy watching something that was filmed during the AIDS epidemic, as in my eyes, it always seemed something that was distant, but when you think about it, it really wasn't. And people are talking about their political beliefs, and people talking about the New York primary, essentially. Most of the cast, essentially everyone but Julie, actually, no, she did end up going, but most of the cast supported a pro life rally. And it's crazy how relevant this still is 30 years later. So, like I mentioned, Julie does end up going to the pro life rally, and the cast listens to a bunch of people talking about it, though she mentions that she herself wouldn't do that, but she gets the woman's right to choose. And this really hits home nowadays, especially with how things have changed with the law since then, and these changes were very recent. That's all I'm going to say about that. Julie spends the night with Darlene, who apparently did not get her check because her boyfriend took it. They speak to another homeless person who created his own condo in the encampment, and he's talking about how he likes his drugs and sex together, which is interesting. Watching all of this is very crazy, but also very raw. There's a bunch of shelters and chugs that we see the community have where they get some clothing. Norman talks about being accused of being gay when he was in high school, how he was bullied and physically pushed around, and he didn't even know what the F word that's related to homosexual people was, though he eventually wanted to confront and face his fears regarding his eventual sexuality. He talks about his relationship history, where he tends to get too clingy and scares the men away, which is happening with the man he is dating. Julie ended up going to Darlene's church on Easter to see her sing, but she didn't show up, and by she I mean Darlene, and Julie's also dealing with not being there for the first Easter in her lifetime with her family. Darlene didn't show up, so Julie comes back to the encampment where the other people who live there states that Darlene left and packed up her stuff to essentially get crack. And that's how the episode ends. So there's not a whole lot to episode 10. Julie calls her parents, who are still not pleased that she didn't return home yet, but the gist of it is that her parents are coming over, though it really just ended up being her mother and her brother. So I see that the father clearly just wasn't supportive at this point in time. They also took in, and by they I mean the house, took in a pet or a few of them from the streets, so they're dealing with all of that too. Anyways, Julie takes Heather to meet her brother and mother as they're staying at a hotel nearby, and they all go to the apartment to visit. So pretty much Julie speaks to her mother about their strained relationship where the mother didn't think that they were strained, but they clear the air and things are seemingly getting better. And we do get to see a bit more of Andre here, where he talks about his mother, and we see them together. They have a great relationship, and I believe she attends like a show of his of some sort. So it's a very simplistic episode. Episode 11 starts, and we are told that something happened between Kevin and Julie, but we never actually saw it. Supposedly, he threw one of the heavy candle holders and threatened to throw it at her, but didn't, from what Julie, Eric, and Heather are recapping. Kevin was on the phone. She asked him who he was on the phone with. He tells her to mind her business. They say a few FUs to one another and how they need to mind their manners. She claims that he's rude to everyone. He told her to suck his dick. He threatened to break her fingers after she said that she would or he would hit her. He left, then was beating on the door. All of this is them just recapping it. And you can tell that they didn't really have the restrictions that they do now, where every conversation has to be on camera. You could just tell that the rules when it comes to reality TV filming wasn't established yet, because on most scenarios after this, they wouldn't have missed filming something like this. So Norman heard that Kevin said that or he heard that Kevin spat on her and threw things at her, and then we see the two men arguing. Kevin is trying to explain himself as Norman wasn't even there and he's not even hearing it. He is mentioning that he was on the phone with someone for a job opportunity since his current job as a teacher is ending in a month, so he needs a new job to pay his bills, and Julie picked up the phone with attitude. But he did not appreciate Norman automatically taking Julie's side. Someone else, I don't know who this person is, maybe a friend of Kevin's or the girlfriend, called out Norman for saying that aggression is the only thing that he knows about Kevin in the 2.5 months that they've been living together. Heather, Eric, and Julie return to the house, and Norman demands her tell him what happened. Julie mentions that he is throwing candlesticks, which he denied. She says that he spit in her face, which he denied. They're both arguing about the semantics, about who did what, who said what, and she admits that she did not apologize for this phone call situation, especially after everything he did in the house, and there's only a week and a half left in the season. What I will mention is that during Kevin's fight with Becky a few episodes back, I believe it was Andre who asked him about it, and he outright denied that there was a fight, though the fight was filmed and aired. So there is a chance that Kevin is doing the same thing here, but the only difference is that it wasn't filmed. So Julie, Norman, and Eric, the three of the white people, go elsewhere, where she mentions that she never wants to be left alone with Kevin again, and they for sure believe her because of Kevin's prior poor attitude. Pretty much Eric believes Julie because he, as in Eric himself, has used the "it's your word against mine" sentiments to get out of several situations. So the language is familiar to Eric, and it's not from a racial lens, it's from the personality lens, and it seems like the both of them kind of realize that they have similar personality traits. We do see Eric cheering Julie up for the entire next day, and Kevin does read a poem at an event, but he does take a girl to the neighborhood where he grew up. Andre confronts Kevin and accuses him of taking out his anger towards white people on the house guests, where Kevin mentions that the country is racist as hell, especially since he was accused of spitting in someone's face and throwing a candle. Andre mentions that it had nothing to do with black or white, and Kevin mentions that everything has to do with him being black. Kevin mentions that just because he's assertive in his opinion, he becomes threatening to white people, and Andre doesn't think anyone in the house is racist, and he asks Kevin if anyone in the house is racist. Kevin mentions that white people have the control and that the house kids can be racist by falling into the trap of society, especially with white people. And Kevin mentioned that prejudice is just to prejudge, which he and a lot of black people are guilty of, for sure. And he came in with his prejudgments and how some of the white roommates proved him wrong and right. Julie walked into the situation and the two of them go outside to talk, where he mentions that he has misdirected anger and right as he's trying to explain, she accuses him of getting too close and aggressive. And I will mention here that I don't think he was in this situation. And she mentions that it's not a black and white issue, and she mentions that he's going to hit her, though from the looks of it, he wasn't. He says that racism is everywhere. And she says, because of people like him, which is a horrible look. She yells that he needs to get out of her face, and she pushes him twice, where she mentions that he's lying about spitting on her. Okay, so just from this situation here, Kevin was not aggressive or forceful, but we see her get physical with him more than once. So this could have happened in the situation that wasn't on camera, but because she has the complexion for protection and the image for protection, and she has a camera pathology, she could have just played it up. I'm just throwing out scenarios here. So pretty much they come to some sort of conclusion, though it really wasn't much of an apology from either side. The episode ends with them getting or going to some sort of party, and Heather is being accused of fighting someone, where she asks for a cup, though the situation was that the woman was trying to take a cup. It looked like a mix or maybe a light skinned woman who made the accusation. The police was called, and Heather is essentially put into the car where she's supposedly arrested. The episode starts with the police driving Heather off, where she gave them all of the information about the incident. She's speaking to the female police officer who asks about Heather's rapping, and essentially no charges were filed at all, where essentially the woman who hit Heather just wanted an apology. Anyways, Heather and all of them return to the party, and everything is fine. After that, Heather is planning on recording another 6 songs for her album, and we do see Andre and his band working on their music too, specifically the music video. So at this point, it does seem like Eric is struggling to get along with some of the roommates, where Heather randomly tells Eric that she doesn't like him and she doesn't want to talk to him, which starts to bother him, which he's complaining about to Judy, claiming that being nice and open with people has let them abuse him several times in the past, and he doesn't want it to happen here. And it's clear that he's referring to Heather here. Eric wants to hurt Heather's cat, and she tells the house, really Eric, that if her cat is messed up, she won't mess with that person. So they're kind of like wrestling with one another, and it's really not a play wrestle either. And the dog's literally barking at them, but essentially that situation happens out, we know how to really end that. But we do get Heather talking to Julie about how she's just going to focus on herself since she wants to get her record out. And I also do think she's just kind of tired of everything that's happening. And it's kind of a shame that her album didn't come out for several years after this, despite all the effort that she put into on the show. So the house is eating dinner together, and it's awkward as hell as they are asking about one another. Sorry. Eric is asking about their weekend, trying to start conversation, and they all kind of just ignore it. Eric finally snaps because he wanted to ask people about their weekends, and they either ignore it completely or chill off into another conversation, where Heather tells him that she can help him pack, since he's stating that he wants to go home. Okay, now I kind of get the context as to why he was how he was on Road Rules All Stars, with not wanting to get too close to that cast and the fake promises of everyone being close after that, and the trust issue. So I'm starting to get Eric more and more. He storms off, and Becky tells Heather that she was hard on him, but Heather mentions that Eric is just a big baby, where Julie does end up comforting him, but he still kind of just wants to be by himself. Eric speaks to Kevin and Becky about Heather and how she is either disengaged in conversations referring to Heather or gets upset whenever she feels threatened in conversations where Heather mentions that Eric is just obsessed with his looks and outer appearance and he can't communicate well. So this kind of goes back to that earlier perception of him and people of his job description that was done either in like the second or third episode. So you're seeing how things are starting to tie together. Supposedly, this is his first time away from home, and Kevin, one of the few people he likes, those were his words, tells him that i.e. Kevin was kicked out at 21 so he could grow up, and Becky tells Eric to pretty much embrace the experience and taking the plunge to be self-sufficient on his own. So we move on a week, and Eric is helping Heather take out her extensions. So they are fine with one another now, where they had a long talk, which was another conversation that was not on camera and not shown. And you start to see some of the frustrations or the ruggedness of the season when it comes to not making sure that certain things were on camera to get to that place. Literally right after this scene, we hear the two of them arguing about soap as he's showering, and Heather was just in the washroom, though Julie was in there too. Though some of the people are speculating that Eric and Julie are fooling around, though they might have just been joking around about this. Anyways, Heather and Eric are arguing about the towel, where pretty much he's given a towel, he sees hair on it, so he claims that that wasn't his towel. And apparently the towel Heather's been using was his, though she argues not because she bought that towel. And yeah, the episode ends with Andre playing his group's music video on the VHS. So we are at the season finale, which covers the final 4 days of the season, and everyone talks about what they have learned about their experiences so far, and how it will never be like this again. Well, they did Homecoming, so that eventually turned out to not be true, though they had to wait like 29 to 30 years. The cast do plan to keep in touch and to see one another after Sunday, which is their final day. Julie saw this as a way to get out of Birmingham and to get a career started in entertainment, specifically dancing, but she's thinking about television and videos with dancing. We get their thoughts about the others, where Heather is just Heather, who is a general, but it's fun too. Becky's music is discussed, and it seems like Becky and Eric are still very distant when they're discussing one another in their final confessionals. And to be honest, I don't really recall them having much discussions that made it on the actual episodes. There's a lot of talk about Eric being attractive, but there's more going on there. Norman has a bunch of stories where he just kind of rambles on, and they do show Norman's last interview where the cast is literally watching him above it. Do it above, where I guess he's doing it in the downstairs area, and they're upstairs, and they can see through a little hall him doing his interview, and he's just rambling there too. So they are playing a game where they have to take a paper out of a fishbowl and have to read the questions for them to answer it. We get a little bit about Heather and Julie's their friendship, my bad, and people talk about Kevin and his views that has people still finding him relatively hard to read and the way he delivers his messages. Then they talk about Andre and his band, where he's kind of just learning to branch out as he is who he is. We apparently learned that Eric and his girlfriend Missy had a huge argument, and during the time they weren't speaking, she fooled around with someone else. So it seems like during the phone call he's having with her that they're kind of breaking up. On their final night, the cast tried to break into the control room to see how everything is done, and they do finally manage to get into the control room, where there's a bunch of producers, camera footage, and huge computers. They kind of changed roles where they were filming and in the editing room where the actual crew were the ones being filmed. It is the final day of the season, and they are playing music, talking about how much they're all going to stay in touch. And from what we know, regarding what Eric said on World Rules All Stars about his season, that they didn't end up staying in touch, but maybe things changed post Homecoming. Apparently, they aired the season 3 days after they finished taping, which is crazy. I don't recall a reality show having that quick of a turnaround that wasn't filmed live. So, I'm going to briefly give my thoughts on the cast. Becky didn't get much screen time throughout the season, with the exception of a few episodes in the middle of the season, where she got into that huge fight with Kevin and her eventually dating one of the show's directors, the producers, my bad, while the season is filming, which is just so unorthodox. I didn't have much of an opinion on her during her One Challenge season, which was done like 9 years after this, and that's probably why she's just so kind of there. And apparently her music career was independent slash niche after this. I did read ahead regarding her on Homecoming, and I'm just disappointed in her. I think out of everyone, Andre is the most under-edited out of all of them, which is a shame, but thinking about it, he was pretty conflict avoidant, and most of his content was just about him promoting his band. From what I read, he did leave his band after a few years and then went to join another one that was still together within the 2010s, and supposedly he was under-edited on Homecoming too. So I definitely remembered Heather from her one challenge season, which was Challenge 2000, which was like 7 or 8 years after this. And I really like her, so it's interesting seeing a much younger version of her here, who became a solo artist after leaving her hip hop group and recording her solo album. Most of the focus she got was on that, and I was shocked with the lack of conversations between her and Kevin, since there's so much conversation about race. Seeing her friendship with Julie over the season was nice, and she got more focus as the season came to an end. Julie was someone that irked my nerves during the first episode or two, especially with the blatant microaggressions. But it seemed like she was a lot more open minded than I was expecting her to be, especially as the season went on. She definitely got a lot of screen time, and I definitely saw her Karen behavior pick back up several times throughout the season, but she didn't bother me much. From what I researched, she went back to her area, settled down, and had a family while teaching dance in a much smaller scale a few years after the show, instead of being a big video dancer, which was what her goal was, supposedly. Norman is obviously the first openly LGBT person to be on the show and reality TV, really, but there really just isn't much discourse on it. There were a lot of scenes dedicated to his poetry and his rambling stuff, which was kind of fun, but he didn't get the most screen time either, and his relationship with that guy, whose name I don't remember, didn't get much focus. I do remember that he was on two challenge seasons, but he wasn't the most notable on those two challenge seasons. So I knew Eric was a big deal in the real world challenge universe, and I obviously watched his three challenge seasons, where I didn't quite get it, but I understand him a lot more regarding his behavior in those seasons after watching this season, and I definitely get why he was the it boy of MTV and reality TV for the next decade after the season. I get it. Obviously, he's a model and did the show for fame and got a lot of screen time, but there's a lot more to him than his looks, and he had to open up to people, though he got into his fair share of drama. I definitely get why he was that guy in the 90s and a bit into the 2000s, but watching the season also gave me a bit more clarity as to why he eventually left the industry and reality TV, compared to a Mark, to have a more low key, under the radar lifestyle today. Kevin was definitely an interesting person to watch this season, and it's crazy as well as scary how accurate and meaningful his words are over 30 years later regarding racism and how much his words still hold true today. And you really don't think you would think his talking points and stuff would age, but it hasn't, which is, I don't know how to take that. I honestly don't think he handled many of the situations he was in to the best of his ability, and reading certain things about his actions after the show definitely has me looking at him somewhat with a side eye. Hearing that he wrote for Vibe magazine and became an activist isn't shocking at all, though from what I've heard, a lot of the same arguments he had on this season kind of came up in Homecoming again. So, in conclusion, watching this season, the first season of The Real World, was a very interesting, complex, almost eternal experience where you are watching something that is so new and so fresh, so unscripted, even on the producer's end, that you will never replicate anything like this ever. Again, I do think the cast worked well with what they got, and so did film crew. You could definitely tell that it was still rough around the edges, which definitely made it endearing in some ways, but also didn't make it the best reality TV experience when it came to it. Not having the set formula and a lot of things that should have been on camera weren't happening on camera. Though it's crazy that a lot of the topics that they discussed and were fighting about in the season are still relevant over 30 years later. And it's definitely going to be interesting watching the seasons after this, as the only seasons I have as a reference point is Portland and Explosion. I might have said Skeleton in the beginning, but I watched Portland, which is Naya's season, and Explosion, which is Corey's season. Those are only two that I watched before this season. And from the little I saw of season two, it has like twice the amount of episodes, so that's gonna be a lot. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'm going to continue with a bunch of content on both channels. And if you're seeing this, the fight compilation video should be on my Vimeo channel. Anyways, thank you all for watching and take care.